Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stumper Wild. In this episode, I'm going to be breaking down a little bit further in the stuff we discussed in the first one, and we're going to do a little bit of cooking as well as some fishing and a little bit of foraging tips, starting with the basics of mushrooms. So stick around. Be sure to stick around to the end, and I'll be sharing everything I put in my fishing gear. Now that we found a good spot, we're going to go ahead and get this set up. As you can see, I have everything from the previous episode. As well as Anya with me in her own bag. Aside from the additional hammock, everything's pretty much set up the same. We did have a little bit of rain coming in that day, so I went ahead and made an altered version on the corner of the tarp. There are many different uses and variations for the tarp, and I'll be sure to show them in future episodes, but for this one, we're just going to pull the corner up. Another efficiency tip is using an empty pillowcase to stuff all your fabrics, such as your bug net and all of your clothes. This makes a makeshift pillow and is super comfortable, and it doesn't take up any additional space in your bag. Now that we have everything set up, let's go ahead and get to this fire. First, of course, we're going to clean the area, make sure there's no debris that'll catch fire, and dig a hole for wind control. The next thing you're going to want to do is gather as much dry material as you can and make a makeshift bird's nest, putting the most flammable stuff in the center. Best way to ensure a fire is by gaining momentum. And understanding that fire goes up, you start with the smallest, driest, and work your way up to the biggest. Fire is definitely an essential to have in the wild, as it keeps you comfortable throughout the night by deterring wildlife and also warmth. What if it goes out? One thing you can do is use your hat. Another more fun thing. The balloons can be useful in a survival situation, one of the other uses being water collection. Quick trick with the fire is once it goes out, the coals will still be warm. Make sure there's nothing sticking out that could potentially burn. Cover it up with all the dirt surrounding it. You'll feel that the ground is still quite warm. After you're sure there's no coals protruding, you can lay down a small towel or blanket. This particular technique was used a lot in the early Western days. It could potentially be the difference between being miserable or happy and comfortable. Now, surviving isn't all fun and games, but that doesn't mean you can't have a little bit of fun. I'm about to introduce to you one of the most ancient instruments in history, and you might find it pretty funny. This instrument is commonly known as the jaw harp and originated in Asia and traveled all the way to the west during the early 1600s. If you've heard this before, it was most likely in cartoons. Moving on to the next thing. In the last episode, we discussed chairs. But in this one, we're going to talk more about the hammock. This is by far one of my most favorite items in the backpack. It can be utilized as a chair or a sleeping space, and I highly recommend the 2-person size. Even if you're by yourself, it's definitely more comfortable. And setup is a breeze. Being lightweight and portable, it's a great way to enjoy nature, even with friends. Even though you can get away with it most of the time, I'd recommend a bug net. It's imperative to remember just how much water you're going to need, because you will need to boil some and drink some, so keep that in mind. Let's start with potatoes. We recommend using smaller ones, and potentially even cutting these in half, as the smaller they are, the quicker they cook. A big benefit of camping with someone else is an additional stove. We're going to make some tea with this one. might take some time to get used to these smaller stoves, but once you get the hang of it, you can make some really good food. But what if you didn't bring any food with you? Let's talk about fishing. If you look online, you're going to find a wide variety of fishing poles. And when people think fishing, they think, I got to catch the biggest fish possible, which is true in most cases. But this is survival. We just need something to eat. An example would be this dock pole. I'm using it at a regular lake, and I'm catching sunfish. Keep in mind, this is the first cast. One of the most common known sunfish is bluegill. While they're edible, you can still use them as bait. If you fish along the bottom, you could potentially catch a much larger catfish, but that's up to you and the circumstances. Another benefit is having an additional pole if you have somebody else with you. Be sure to recognize the local fishing laws. At this point, you may be wondering, is that all you've ever caught is bluegill on this? Well, the particular yellow pole that I'm showing in these videos for the campsites, I've caught quite a few fish, including a saltwater oyster toadfish. This thing's wicked and definitely has teeth, so watch out. It is edible, but I much prefer trout. But if you ever went fishing before, people will tell you it's not always about catching fish. Well, we've got fishing poles, but what about bait? Check out this tip. Just take a regular plastic bottle, cut off the top, flip it inside, stuff it this way. Now, take it to a good spot. Since it was saltwater and on the beach, I looked for a little bit of drain off coming from land into the ocean, knowing that's where fish like to feed. Now add some bait. I'm using power bait. I like to keep something like this in my fishing gear in case I can't find anything. Now let's place this bottle. You want to completely submerge it. And it needs to be weighed down. After a little while, come back and check and see what you got. In this particular catch, I got about 3 or 4. Now let's set up a quick rig and start fishing. I didn't catch anything this day, but if you remember in the last episode when we hiked to filter some water, here's a bass. Another option you can utilize if you're not big on fishing is foraging. Everywhere you go is a vast supermarket full of plants that are edible. The only thing is, you need to know which ones are and which ones aren't, especially with mushrooms. There are a large variety of mushrooms out there. That's why you have to be extremely careful in deciding which ones you decide to ingest or which ones you decide to leave alone. It's always recommended to bring along somebody to mentor you. This way you have a personal experience with the mushroom and you know exactly what it is before you try eating it. Once you gain the knowledge, there are a few things out there that you would really enjoy, like these charcoal burners, a type of russula, or a lion's mane. Not only is this mushroom edible, but it's also full of a lot of medicinal properties. You also want to make sure that you get them at the right time. This one's edible, but it's beyond its date. This is an oyster shroom. And sometimes things look like mushrooms, but aren't. This is known as ghost pipe, and it's actually a flower. Accidents can happen, that's why I always recommend a first aid kit, and we're going to break this down in the next episode. Now that we've relaxed long enough and had our meal, it's time to pack up. Last time, I glanced over it briefly in the beginning of the episode, but I'm going to go a little bit more in depth. I like to start with the heaviest stuff like my tarp and blankets. These are the things that are essential, but I don't use very often. And then I'll put my stove and all the other cutlery and the heavy things in the middle, followed by the softer and more convenient use things that I'll want to grab quickly. This makes everything really efficient and makes my bag much more useful. Before leaving your site, make sure there's no remnants of you being there. Or anyone else for that matter. I almost forgot. Let's rewind and talk about that fishing gear I promised earlier. This isn't your traditional tackle box. I'm utilizing a fanny pack, believe it or not, to store everything pretty much efficiently. First, let's talk about this telescoping rod from Eagle Claw. It's probably one of the coolest ones I've found. It's really easy to find. It's at Walmart and a lot of fishing stores. As you can see, it starts out pretty small and you can pull these out and it becomes a full-size fishing pole. It's pretty easy to use. The reel handle folds up and all you gotta do is loosen up the screw to put it back where it goes. When I'm packing it up, I like to put it back exactly the way it was, and then I'll loosen up the drag so I get a little bit of turning, and then I'll tighten everything back up. The side of the handle, and then the drag. Now everything is nice and tight. Another neat item is this pole stake. It's a game changer. Get one. Inside the bag I've got some long-term bait. I've got this small tackle box that came with one of the poles. I have some pliers, some top, bottoms, and jigs, and some plies. Another thing you want to have is a glove. It's useful for a lot of things. I like to utilize saltwater bobbers because of functionality, and this fish scale. This thing is awesome. It comes with some measuring tape and a little hook on the bottom. Check this out. Pop it out. You can hook a fish on it, or even your backpack. You can see how much it weighs with this little window. Another little thing I like to have for some convenience is some nail clippers. It's another thing that's multiple use. You'll notice I like to do that a lot. Now here's a really cool tip. This is just a regular sinker cartridge. And each thing I've decided to change it out with swivels, fishing hooks. Oh, quick tip with fishing hooks. You can use safety pins to keep them well organized so they don't keep getting tangled up. Then sinkers. And the other one I've got a glow stick and some additional hooks. Now let's flip it over to the back. I like to use leader line. I have a 4-pound for freshwater and 8-pound for saltwater, and these are my favorite baits. One of them is these fake worms. This one's basically fake crickets or dragonfly larvae, and these are minnows. If you found any tips in this video to be helpful, or you have any that you would like to share yourself, be sure to comment. And as always, thanks for watching.